Look at the massive, intricate machinery of human civilization, the sudden, violent rise of global superpowers, the slow, agonizing, inevitable collapse of ancient empires, the complex economic engines that drive modern cities, the psychological bonds that hold nations together, and the brutal political realities of power. When you picture the brilliant minds who first realized that human societies do not just happen by accident, but operate on strict, observable, scientific laws, who do you picture? You are taught to revere the European Enlightenment. You picture French philosophers like Auguste Comte sitting in 19th century Paris, miraculously inventing the discipline of sociology. You picture political theorists like Machiavelli in Renaissance Italy, coldly writing the rules of power and statecraft. You are taught that before the European mind woke up, the entire world viewed history as nothing more than a chaotic collection of religious myths, divine interventions, and fairy tales. We are told that the West alone figured out how to rationally analyze the rise and fall of human civilization. But the absolute foundational blueprint for the social sciences was not drafted in 19th century Paris. The rational economic analysis of how empires rise, peak, and decay was not discovered during the European Enlightenment. And the exact sociological laws that govern human behavior were not engineered by a French philosopher. They were meticulously mapped out over 400 years earlier by an Arab polymath writing by candlelight in a remote North African fortress. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the sociology heist and how a 14th century Arab actually invented the social sciences. What follows is the story of a massive academic cover-up and one of the most blatant acts of intellectual identity theft the Western humanities establishment absolutely does not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who refuses to accept the heavily curated, highly sanitized historical narratives handed to you in school, if you want to know the actual, hidden architects of modern political science, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us begin with the official timeline of the social sciences, the version of historical analysis you were tested on, which meticulously paints Europe as the sole, undisputed pioneer of rational human thought. According to the Western narrative, the story of history before the Enlightenment was a complete intellectual wasteland. For centuries, you were told, the world had absolutely no understanding of sociology, economics, or political realism. History was just storytelling. It was a chaotic list of kings, brutal battles, and long lineages. The textbook claims that historians simply wrote down whatever the king told them to write, without ever questioning the underlying mechanics of why things happened. In this dark age of the mind, if an empire collapsed, it was simply the will of the gods. If a city starved, it was magic, a curse, or bad luck. If an army was defeated, it was a lack of faith. There was absolutely no rational, scientific analysis of human behavior on a grand scale. The standard textbook narrative tells us that this rigid, superstitious paralysis blinded human intellect until the miraculous dawn of the European intellectual revolution. Suddenly, the narrative claims, Renaissance thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli invent political realism, separating politics from morality. Then, in the 1830s, a French philosopher named Auguste Comte looks at the chaos of the French Revolution and realizes that human society can be studied exactly like physics or biology. Comte officially coins the term sociology. Soon after, figures like Emile Durkheim and Karl Marx arrive to map out the mechanics of labor, social cohesion, and the economy. The West completely crowns itself. Europe boldly declares that the monumental transition from mythological storytelling to the hard, empirical science of human civilization is the pure, unadulterated invention of the European mind. They draw a straight, unbroken line from the dark ages of history directly to the university departments of Paris, London, and Berlin, completely ignoring a massive, glaring, 400-year gap in the timeline of human observation. But if you actually dig into the historical archives, if you look at the massive volumes of sociological theory written centuries before the European Enlightenment even began, and if you read the exact Arabic phrases describing social cohesion, urban decay, and the biological lifespan of empires, that beautiful, isolated narrative of Western sociological genius completely shatters. To find the true father of the social sciences, we have to completely abandon the prestigious academic salons of 19th century Europe. We have to travel back in time, over 400 years before Auguste Comte coined the word sociology. We have to travel to the brutal, shifting, highly volatile political landscape of North Africa in the 14th century. In the 1300s, the Islamic world of North Africa and Andalusia was in a state of chaotic transition. Great dynasties were rising and violently collapsing. The Black Death was ravaging the Mediterranean, And operating directly inside this violent, unpredictable political ecosystem was a brilliant diplomat, judge, and scholar named Abd al-Rahman ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was not an aristocratic European philosopher observing society from the safe, comfortable window of a university. He was a man deeply embedded in the terrifying reality of human politics. He negotiated with ruthless kings. He was thrown into prison for political conspiracies. He served as an ambassador to the terrifying Mongol conqueror, Timur. He survived the plague that wiped out his parents and his teachers. He saw powerful empires rise to absolute dominance and crumble into dust before his very eyes. Through this intense, dangerous life, Ibn Khaldun realized something profound that the West would not realize for another 4 centuries. He realized that the way history was being written was completely, fundamentally broken. He looked at the historians of his time and saw that they were just blindly copying down stories. They were accepting obvious myths and impossible numbers just because an authority figure said it was true. Ibn Khaldun realized that history is utterly meaningless and completely untrustworthy if you do not understand the underlying laws of the human beings making that history. He realized that human societies are not random. The rise and fall of an empire is not just the will of God, and it is not just luck. Human civilization operates like a living, breathing biological organism. It has a birth, a peak, and an inevitable, scientifically observable death. Driven by this massive, perception-altering epiphany, Ibn Khaldun did something unprecedented. In the year 1377, exhausted by the deadly politics of the royal courts, he retreated to a remote, fortified castle in Algeria called Khalat ibn Salama. He sat down to write a definitive history of the world. But he realized that before he could write a single word of history, he had to invent a completely new scientific discipline to test whether that history was even possible. He wrote a massive, sprawling, revolutionary introduction to his history book. He called this introduction the Muqaddimah. And inside the pages of the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun explicitly declared the creation of a brand new science. He called it Ilm al-Umran, the science of human social organization. He was about to map out the absolute core engine of sociology, political science, and economics, a staggering 4 centuries before the Western world claimed to have discovered them. Inside the pages of the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun achieved something that shatters the entire timeline of Western academia. Centuries before the European scientific establishment even possessed a vocabulary for sociological analysis, Ibn Khaldun engineered a flawless, mechanical, empirical model of human civilization. He did not just describe kings and battles. He looked beneath the surface of history and recognized that the ultimate engine of any civilization is a profound, underlying psychological concept he called Asabiyyah. Asabiyyah translates roughly to social cohesion, group solidarity, or tribalism. It is the shared psychological bond that makes individuals willing to sacrifice themselves for the survival of the group. Ibn Khaldun observed that the harshest environments on Earth produce the strongest Asabiyyah. Nomads living in the brutal, unforgiving deserts or mountains are forced to rely on each other absolutely. They are tough, hungry, and deeply united. He mapped out exactly how this psychological weapon dictates the fate of empires. These highly united nomadic tribes inevitably sweep out of the wilderness and conquer the soft, wealthy, deeply divided cities. But then, Ibn Khaldun identified the ultimate, inescapable sociological trap. The moment the conquerors settle into the city, the countdown to their destruction begins. He explicitly mapped out the biological lifespan of a dynasty, stating with absolute scientific precision that an empire lasts exactly 3 to 4 generations, or roughly 120 years. The first generation are the conquerors, hardened by the desert, fiercely loyal, and driven by immense asabiyyah. The second generation inherits the conquered wealth. They build grand monuments, establish bureaucracies, and begin to taste luxury, but they still remember the toughness of their fathers. The third generation grows up completely surrounded by absolute wealth and comfort. They forget the harshness of the desert entirely. They become obsessed with art, leisure, and sophisticated urban life, and their asabiyyah completely fractures. They no longer want to fight. They hire mercenaries to do it for them. By the fourth generation, the rulers are so weak, corrupt, paranoid, and disconnected from their people that the empire is essentially a hollow shell. And inevitably, a new, hungry group of nomads with strong asabiyyah sweeps in from the desert, conquers the decaying city, and the cycle begins all over again. He had just mathematically mapped the rise and fall of human civilization. He proved that the decay of a society is not an accident or a divine curse. It is a built-in, inescapable sociological law. But his absolute greatest breakthrough was not just political theory, it was economics. Centuries before Adam Smith or Karl Marx were even born, Ibn Khaldun wrote the absolute foundational rules of labor, value, and taxation. He explicitly detailed how a civilization in its early, healthy stages keeps taxes low. This low taxation stimulates massive economic growth, encourages businesses to expand, and ultimately generates massive revenues for the state. But as the empire decays and the rulers become obsessed with luxury and the funding of their massive mercenary armies, they inevitably raise taxes. Ibn Khaldun proved that excessively high taxes crush the incentive to work. Businesses collapse, trade stops, the economy is destroyed, and the state ultimately collects significantly less revenue than when taxes were low. This exact economic principle is proudly taught in modern Western universities as the Laffer curve, named after a 20th-century American economist, completely ignoring the Arab scholar who explicitly documented the exact mathematical phenomenon 600 years earlier. Let the absolute magnitude of that intellectual breakthrough sink in. He was diagnosing urban decay, analyzing supply and demand, explaining the division of labor, and dissecting the psychological bonds of human tribes in the year 1377. He explicitly stated that history is governed by laws that apply to the past, the present, and the future. He completely stripped magic, superstition, and divine right out of the historical equation. If a city fell, it wasn't because God was angry. It was because their Asabiyyah had fractured and their taxation was too high. He invented the rational, secular analysis of power in society. He was utilizing the exact sociological framework that French and German philosophers would claim to have miraculously invented, a staggering 400 to 500 years later in Paris and Berlin. And Ibn Khaldun's brilliant theories were not just vague philosophical musings. He explicitly, proudly declared that he had invented a brand new science. He wrote, "This science is an independent science. This is a newly invented science, remarkable and highly useful. It is the result of massive research, not a gift from the ancients." He knew exactly what he had achieved. He had taken the chaotic, terrifying mysteries of human behavior and subjected them to rational, observational, sociological science. So, a massive, terrifying question emerges for the defenders of the European Enlightenment. If the exact mechanics of sociology, the cyclical theory of history, political realism, and complex economic principles were all established, documented, and actively defined as a unique science by an Arab scholar in the 14th century, how did European men like Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim get all the credit? How did the West successfully execute this massive academic cover-up, claiming they invented the social sciences out of thin air in the 19th century? To answer that terrifying question, we have to completely dismantle the myth of the isolated European intellectual awakening. We have to look at the massive, highly organized, and deliberately obscured academic extraction network of the British and French empires. You are taught that the European Enlightenment was a closed intellectual loop. You are told that in the 1800s, Western philosophers simply woke up, looked at society rationally, and spontaneously invented sociology. The Western narrative violently insists that the architecture of political and social science is a purely European invention, completely untainted by the outside world. But the academic, geopolitical, and colonial reality of the 19th century destroys that myth completely. In the 1830s, exactly the same time Auguste Comte was supposedly inventing sociology in France, the French military was violently invading and colonizing Algeria and North Africa. The French colonial administration was absolutely desperate to understand the incredibly complex tribal dynamics, the social cohesion, and the history of the Islamic societies they were trying to conquer. And what did the French colonial officers and academic Orientalists find when they arrived in North Africa? They found the Muqaddimah. They found a perfectly preserved, multi-volume sociological masterpiece, written specifically about the tribes, economics, and political cycles of the very region they were occupying. European scholars were utterly stunned. They realized they were holding a text that was centuries ahead of anything Europe had ever produced. The French government aggressively funded the translation of Ibn Khaldun's work. By the mid-19th century, complete French translations of the Muqaddimah were widely available and heavily studied in the intellectual salons of Paris. The greatest European economists, sociologists, and historians of the era were intimately reading the exact sociological blueprints drafted by an Arab polymath 400 years prior. The knowledge that human society operates on observable laws, that taxation dictates economic survival, and that social cohesion is the ultimate engine of history was not invented by the European Enlightenment. It was actively imported, translated, and absorbed from the very people Europe was colonizing. But the Western academic establishment had a major, terrifying ideological problem. They were aggressively conquering the Middle East and North Africa, justifying their brutal colonial rule by claiming they were bringing civilization and rational thought to backward primitive societies. They could not publicly admit that the very societies they were conquering had actually invented the foundational science of civilization 4 centuries before Europe. It would completely destroy their fragile supremacist narrative of Western intellectual dominance. So, they engaged in a deliberate, highly calculated process of academic erasure. When Western universities formalized the discipline of sociology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they executed a massive, deliberate historical blind spot. They drew a straight, unbroken line from the ancient Greek philosophers directly to the French Enlightenment, completely skipping over the 400 years of highly advanced, heavily translated Islamic social science. They took Ibn Khaldun, a man who had literally written the world's first physical manuscript detailing social cohesion, the biological lifespan of empires, and the Laffer curve, and they relegated his work to obscurity. If they mentioned him at all, they dismissed him as a mere medieval historian, completely ignoring his absolute mastery over the mechanics of human society. This massive, highly successful historical erasure set the perfect stage for the ultimate sociological heist. By the 20th century, the West had completely convinced itself that they were the undisputed pioneers of rational political science. Let us look at Auguste Comte, the legendary figure universally worshipped by Western textbooks as the sole father of sociology. We are told that Comte's realization that society can be studied scientifically was a completely isolated, uniquely Western intellectual miracle. Western history treats this as an unprecedented leap in human evolution. But if you actually look at the conceptual framework of Comte's sociology, the illusion of an entirely new science completely evaporates. The fundamental realization that human society is an organism, that history operates on observable laws, and that you can systematically study the rise and decay of human groups is the exact fundamental concept of Ilm al-Umran that Ibn Khaldun established in a North African fortress 400 years prior. Comte did not invent the concept of sociology, he simply gave it a French name. The Western pioneers of the social sciences were undeniably influential, but they were not the architects. They were the inheritors of a massive, heavily translated, highly advanced Islamic intellectual framework. The Western academic establishment did not invent political science. They simply translated the Muqaddimah, used its sociological blueprints to understand the very people they were colonizing, and then had the absolute arrogance to claim they had invented the very concept of human society. Do you see the absolute arrogance of the heist? First, they found the masterpiece in North Africa and translated it to study their subjects. Then, they used that exact philosophical framework to structure their own university departments in Paris and London. And finally, when the brilliance of the science became the undisputed foundation of the modern academic world, they simply erased the Arab diplomat from the timeline of human discovery, passing off his genius as the miraculous invention of the French Enlightenment. They took the absolute foundation of modern sociology, smashed the Arabic name off the university door, and slapped a European patent on it. They built the modern social sciences on a stolen blueprint. Today, we live in a world completely dictated by political science and economics. We build massive, prestigious university departments dedicated to sociology. We rely on the clinical understanding of social cohesion, taxation, and political cycles to navigate the modern global economy. We sit in university classrooms and nod along as professors praise the unique, unparalleled, isolated genius of the European Enlightenment. We are told that the West alone crawled out of the darkness of mythological storytelling and figured out how to safely navigate the true mechanics of human civilization. But the modern sociological mind was not born in a Parisian intellectual salon. The mechanical reality of urban decay and the lifespan of empires was not discovered during the French Revolution. The absolute foundation of social cohesion and the rational analysis of human power was entirely awakened, shaped, and permanently defined by an Arab scholar in 14th century North Africa. Modern sociology is not a spontaneous European miracle. It is a massive, highly successful academic heist. The West didn't invent the social sciences. They simply walked into a North African library, translated the sociological manuals, finally applied the concepts to their own societies, and then convinced the rest of the planet that they had invented rationality itself. Everything you just heard is documented. The massive, undeniable physical reality of Ibn Khaldun's 14th century manuscript, the Muqaddimah, is sitting right there in the historical archives. The exact, flawless clinical articulation of Asabiyyah, the biological cycle of dynasties, and economic taxation centuries before Europe even understood the concept, is an undisputed historical fact. The undeniable existence of European academics actively translating and studying Ibn Khaldun's sociological theories while colonizing North Africa is a matter of absolute physical record. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why is the true father of sociology and the inventor of the social sciences deliberately kept out of your textbook? If this completely shattered how you see the history of the humanities, the birth of sociology, and the myth of Western intellectual supremacy, share it with someone who needs to hear this. The buried record demands the truth. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.